In the end, it was part of the game that Sidney should tumble down upon Dyke, whereat he invariably vented a great bellow as if in pain, declaring that his ribs were broken. Gasping, his eyes shut, he pretended to be in the extreme of dissolution. Perhaps he was dying. Sidney, always a little uncertain, amused but distressed, shook him nervously, tugging at his beard, pushing open his eyelid with one finger, imploring him not to frighten her, to wake up and be good. On this occasion, while yet he was half-dressed, Dyke tiptoed into his mother's room to look at Sidney fast asleep in her little iron cot, her arm under her head, her lips parted. With infinite precaution he kissed her twice, and then finding one little stocking hung with its mate very neatly over the back of a chair, dropped into it a dime rolled up in a wad of paper. He winked all to himself and went out again, closing the door with exaggerated carefulness. He breakfasted alone, Mrs. Dyke pouring his coffee and handing him his plate of ham and eggs, and half an hour later took himself off in his springless skeleton wagon, humming a tune behind his beard and cracking the whip over the backs of his staid and stolid farm horses. The morning was fine, the sun just coming up. He left Guadalajara, sleeping and lifeless, on his left, and going across lots over an angle of Quien-Sabe, came out upon the upper road, a mile below the Long Trestle. He was in great spirits, looking about him over the brown fields, ruddy with the dawn. Almost directly in front of him, but far off, the gilded dome of the courthouse at Bonneville was glinting radiant in the first rays of the sun, while a few miles distant, toward the north, the venerable campanile of the Mission San Juan stood silhouetted in purplish black against the flaming east. As he proceeded, the great farm horses jogging forward, placid, deliberate, the countryside waked to another day. Crossing the irrigating ditch farther on, he met a gang of Portuguese, with picks and shovels over their shoulders, just going to work. Hooven, already abroad, shouted him a good morning from behind the fence of Los Muertos. Far off, toward the southwest, in the bare expanse of the open fields, where a clump of eucalyptus and cypress trees set a dark green note, a thin stream of smoke rose straight into the air from the kitchen of Derrick's ranch houses. But a mile or so beyond the Long Trestle he was surprised to see Magnus Derrick's protege, the one-time shepherd, Vanamee, coming across Quien-Sabe by a trail from one of Annixter's division houses. Without knowing exactly why, Dyke received the impression that the young man had not been in bed all of that night. As the two approached each other, Dyke eyed the young fellow. He was distrustful of Vanamee, having the country-bred suspicion of any person he could not understand. Vanamee was, beyond doubt, no part of the life of ranch and country town. He was an alien, a vagabond, a strange fellow who came and went in mysterious fashion, making no friends, keeping to himself. Why did he never wear a hat? Why indulge in a fine, black-pointed beard, when either a round beard or a mustache was the invariable custom? Why did he not cut his hair? Above all, why did he prowl about so much at night? As the two passed each other, Dyke, for all his good nature, was a little blunt in his greeting, and looked back at the ex-shepherd over his shoulder. Dyke was right in his suspicion. Vanamee's bed had not been disturbed for 3 nights. On the Monday of that week he had passed the entire night in the garden of the Mission, overlooking the Seed Ranch in the little valley. Tuesday evening had found him miles away from that spot, in a deep arroyo in the Sierra foothills to the eastward, while Wednesday he had slept in an abandoned dobe on Osterman's stock range, 20 miles from his resting place of the night before. The fact of the matter was that the old restlessness had once more seized upon Vanamee. Something began tugging at him. The spur of some unseen rider touched his flank. The instinct of the wanderer woke and moved. For some time now he had been a part of the Los Muertos staff. On Quien-Sabe, as on the other ranches, the slack season was at hand. While waiting for the wheat to come up, no one was doing much of anything. Vanamee had come over to Los Muertos and spent most of his days on horseback, riding the range, rounding up and watching the cattle in the 4th Division of the ranch. But if the vagabond instinct now roused itself in the strange fellow's nature, a counter-influence had also set in. More and more Vanamee frequented the Mission garden after nightfall, sometimes remaining there till the dawn began to whiten, lying prone on the ground, his chin on his folded arms, his eyes searching the darkness over the little valley of the Seed Ranch, watching. As the days went by, he became more reticent than ever. Presley often came to find him on the stock range, a lonely figure in the great wilderness of bare green hillsides, but Vanamee no longer took him into his confidence. Father Soria alone heard his strange stories. Dyke drove on toward Bonneville, thinking over the whole matter. He knew, as everyone did in that part of the country, the legend of Vanamee and Annalay, the romance of the mission garden, the mystery of the other, Vanamee's flight to the deserts of the Southwest, his periodic returns, his strange, reticent, solitary character. But, like many another of the country people, he accounted for Vanamee by a short and easy method. No doubt the fellow's wits were turned. That was the long and short of it. The ex-engineer reached the post office in Bonneville toward 11 o'clock, but he did not at once present his notice of the arrival of his consignment at Ruggles' office. It entertained him to indulge in an hour's lounging about the streets. It was seldom he got into town, and when he did he permitted himself the luxury of enjoying his evident popularity. He met friends everywhere, in the post office, in the drugstore, in the barber shop, and around the courthouse. With each one he held a moment's conversation. Almost invariably this ended in the same way. "Come on in, have a drink." "Well, I don't care if I do." And the friends proceeded to the Yosemite bar, pledging each other with punctilious ceremony. Dyke, however, was a strictly temperate man. His life on the engine had trained him well. Alcohol he never touched, drinking instead ginger ale, sarsaparilla and iron, soft drinks. At the drugstore, which also kept a stock of miscellaneous stationery, his eye was caught by a transparent slate, a child's toy, where, upon a little pane of frosted glass, one could trace with considerable elaboration outline figures of cows, plows, bunches of fruit, and even rural watermills that were printed on slips of paper underneath. "Now there's an idea, Jim," he observed to the boy behind the soda-water fountain. "I know a little tad that would just about jump out of her skin for that. Think I'll have to take it with me." "How's Sidney getting along?" the other asked while wrapping up the package. Dyke's enthusiasm had made of his little girl a celebrity throughout Bonneville. The ex-engineer promptly became voluble, assertive, doggedly emphatic. "Smartest little tad in all Tulare County, and more fun. A regular whole show in herself." "And the hops?" inquired the other. "Bully," declared Dyke, with the good-natured man's readiness to talk of his private affairs to anyone who would listen. "Bully. I'm dead sure of a bonanza crop by now. The rain came just right. I actually don't know as I can store the crop in those barns I built. It's going to be so big. That foreman of mine was a daisy. Jim, I'm going to make money in that deal. After I've paid off the mortgage, you know I had to mortgage, yes, crop and homestead both, but I can pay it off and all the interest to boot. Lovely. Well, and as I was saying, after all expenses are paid off, I'll clear big money, my son. Yes, sir. I knew there was boodle in hops. You know the crop is contracted for already. Sure, the foreman managed that. He's a daisy. Chap in San Francisco will take it all and at the advanced price. I wanted to hang on to see if it wouldn't go to 6 cents, but the foreman said, 'No, that's good enough.' So I signed. Ain't it bully, hey? Then what'll you do?" "Well, I don't know. I'll have a lay-off for a month or so and take the little tad and mother up and show 'em the city, Frisco, until it's time for the schools to open. And then we'll put Sid in the seminary at Marysville. Catch on? I suppose you'll stay right by hops now." "Right you are, my son. I know a good thing when I see it. There's plenty others going into hops next season. I set 'em the example. Wouldn't be surprised if it came to be a regular industry hereabouts. I'm planning ahead for next year already. I can let the foreman go, now that I've learned the game myself, and I think I'll buy a piece of land off Kiansabe and get a bigger crop, and build a couple more barns, and by George, in about 5 years' time I'll have things humming. I'm going to make money, Jim." He emerged once more into the street and went up the block leisurely, planting his feet squarely. He fancied that he could feel he was considered of more importance nowadays. He was no longer a subordinate, an employee. He was his own man, a proprietor, an owner of land, furthering a successful enterprise. No one had helped him. He had followed no one's lead. He had struck out unaided for himself, and his success was due solely to his own intelligence, industry, and foresight. He squared his great shoulders till the blue gingham of his jumper all but cracked. Of late his great blond beard had grown, and the work in the sun had made his face very red. Under the visor of his cap, relic of his engineering days, his blue eyes twinkled with vast good nature. He felt that he made a fine figure as he went by a group of young girls in lawns and muslins and garden hats on their way to the post office. He wondered if they looked after him, wondered if they had heard that he was in a fair way to become a rich man. But the chronometer in the window of the jewelry store warned him that time was passing. He turned about and, crossing the street, took his way to Ruggles' office, which was the freight as well as the land office of the P&S.W. Railroad. As he stood for a moment at the counter in front of the wire partition, waiting for the clerk to make out the order for the freight agent at the depot, Dyke was surprised to see a familiar figure in conference with Ruggles himself by a desk inside the railing. The figure was that of a middle-aged man, fat, with a great stomach, which he stroked from time to time. As he turned about, addressing a remark to the clerk, Dyke recognized S. Behrman. The banker, railroad agent, and political manipulator seemed to the ex-engineer's eyes to be more gross than ever. His smooth-shaven jowls stood out big and tremulous on either side of his face. The roll of fat on the nape of his neck, sprinkled with sparse, stiff hairs, bulged out with great prominence. His great stomach, covered with a light brown linen vest, stamped with innumerable interlocked horseshoes, protruded far in advance, enormous, aggressive. He wore his inevitable round-topped hat of stiff brown straw, varnished so bright that it reflected the light of the office windows like a helmet. And even from where he stood, Dyke could hear his loud breathing and the clink of the hollow links of his watch chain upon the vest buttons of imitation pearl as his stomach rose and fell. Dyke looked at him with attention. There was the enemy, the representative of the trust with which Derrick's League was locking horns. The great struggle had begun to invest the combatants with interest. Daily, almost hourly, Dyke was in touch with the ranchers, the wheat growers. He heard their denunciations, their growls of exasperation and defiance. Here was the other side, this placid, fat man with a stiff straw hat and linen vest, who never lost his temper, who smiled affably upon his enemies, giving them good advice, commiserating with them in one defeat after another, never ruffled, never excited, sure of his power, conscious that back of him was the machine, the colossal force, the inexhaustible coffers of a mighty organization, vomiting millions to the League's thousands. The League was clamorous, ubiquitous, its objects known to every urchin on the streets, but the trust was silent, its ways inscrutable. The public saw only results. It worked on in the dark calm, disciplined, irresistible. Abruptly, Dyke received the impression of the multitudinous ramifications of the colossus. Under his feet the ground seemed mined. Down there below him in the dark the huge tentacles went silently twisting and advancing, spreading out in every direction, sapping the strength of all opposition, quiet, gradual, biding the time to reach up and out and grip with a sudden unleashing of gigantic strength. "I'll be wanting some cars of you people before the summer is out," observed Dyke to the clerk as he folded up and put away the order that the other had handed him. He remembered perfectly well that he had arranged the matter of transporting his crops some months before. But his role of proprietor amused him, and he liked to busy himself again and again with the details of his undertaking. "I suppose," he added, "you'll be able to give 'em to me. There'll be a big wheat crop to move this year, and I don't want to be caught in any car famine." "Oh, you'll get your cars," murmured the other. "I'll be the means of bringing business your way," Dyke went on. "I have done so well with my hops that there are a lot of others going into the business next season. Suppose," he continued, struck with an idea, "suppose we went into some sort of pool, a sort of shippers' organization. Could you give us special rates, cheaper rates, say 1.5 cents? The other looked up. 1.5 cents? Say 4.5 cents, and maybe I'll talk business with you." 4.5 cents, returned Dyke. "I don't see it. Why, the regular rate is only 2 cents. "No, it isn't," answered the clerk, looking him gravely in the eye. "It's 5 cents. "Well, there's where you are wrong, my son," Dyke retorted genially. "You look it up. You'll find the freight on hops from Bonneville to Frisco is 2 cents a pound for carload lots. You told me that yourself last fall." "That was last fall," observed the clerk. There was a silence. Dyke shot a glance of suspicion at the other. Then, reassured, he remarked, "You look it up. You'll see I'm right." S. Behrman came forward and shook hands politely with the ex-engineer. "Anything I can do for you, Mr. Dyke?" Dyke explained. When he had done speaking, the clerk turned to S. Behrman and observed respectfully, "Our regular rate on hops is 5 cents." "Yes," answered S. Behrman, pausing to reflect. "Yes, Mr. Dyke, that's right, 5 cents." The clerk brought forward a folder of yellow paper and handed it to Dyke. It was inscribed at the top, Tariff Schedule Number 8, and underneath these words in brackets was a smaller inscription, Supersedes Number 7 of August 1st. "See for yourself," said S. Behrman. He indicated an item under the head of Miscellany. "The following rates for carriage of hops and carload lots," read Dyke, "take effect June 1st, and will remain in force until superseded by a later tariff. Those quoted beyond Stockton are subject to changes in traffic arrangements with carriers by water from that point." In the list that was printed below, Dyke saw that the rate for hops between Bonneville or Guadalajara and San Francisco was 5 cents. For a moment Dyke was confused. Then swiftly the matter became clear in his mind. The railroad had raised the freight on hops from 2 cents to 5. All his calculations as to a profit on his little investment he had based on a freight rate of 2 cents a pound. He was under contract to deliver his crop. He could not draw back. The new rate ate up every cent of his gains. He stood there ruined. "Why, what do you mean?" he burst out. "You promised me a rate of 2 cents, and I went ahead with my business with that understanding. What do you mean?" S. Behrman and the clerk watched him from the other side of the counter. "The rate is 5 cents, declared the clerk doggedly. "Well, that ruins me," shouted Dyke. "Do you understand? I won't make 50 cents. Make? Why, I will owe. I'll be... That ruins me. Do you understand?" The other raised a shoulder. "We don't force you to ship. You can do as you like. The rate is 5 cents. "Well, but damn you, I'm under contract to deliver. What am I going to do? Why, you told me, you promised me, a 2-cent rate." "I don't remember it," said the clerk. "I don't know anything about that. But I know this. I know that hops have gone up. I know the German crop was a failure and that the crop in New York wasn't worth the hauling. Hops have gone up to nearly $1. You don't suppose we don't know that, do you, Mr. Dyke? What's the price of hops got to do with you?" "It's got this to do with us," returned the other with a sudden aggressiveness, "that the freight rate has gone up to meet the price. We're not doing business for our health. My orders are to raise your rate to 5 cents, and I think you are getting off easy." Dyke stared in blank astonishment. For the moment, the audacity of the affair was what most appealed to him. He forgot its personal application. "Good Lord," he murmured. "Good Lord, what will you people do next? Look here, what's your basis of applying freight rates anyhow?" he suddenly vociferated with furious sarcasm. "What's your rule? What are you guided by?" But at the words, S. Behrman, who had kept silent during the heat of the discussion, leaned abruptly forward. For the only time in his knowledge, Dyke saw his face inflamed with anger and with the enmity and contempt of all this farming element with whom he was contending. "Yes, what's your rule? What's your basis?" demanded Dyke, turning swiftly to him. S. Behrman emphasized each word of his reply with a tap of one forefinger on the counter before him. "All the traffic will bear." The ex-engineer stepped back a pace, his fingers on the ledge of the counter to steady himself. He felt himself grow pale. His heart became a mere leaden weight in his chest, inert, refusing to beat. In a second the whole affair, in all its bearings, went speeding before the eye of his imagination like the rapid unrolling of a panorama. Every cent of his earnings was sunk in this hop business of his. More than that, he had borrowed money to carry it on, certain of success, borrowed of S. Behrman, offering his crop and his little home as security. Once he failed to meet his obligations, S. Behrman would foreclose. Not only would the railroad devour every morsel of his profits, but also it would take from him his home. At a blow he would be left penniless and without a home. What would then become of his mother? And what would become of the little Tad? She whom he had been planning to educate like a veritable lady. For all that year he had talked of his ambition for his little daughter to everyone he met. All Bonneville knew of it. What a mark for jibes he had made of himself, the working man turned farmer. What a target for jeers, he who had fancied he could elude the railroad. He remembered he had once said the Great Trust had overlooked his little enterprise, disdaining to plunder such small fry. He should have known better than that. How had he ever imagined the road would permit him to make any money? Anger was not in him yet. No rousing of the blind, white-hot wrath that leaps to the attack with prehensile fingers moved him. The blow merely crushed, staggered, confused. He stepped aside to give place to a coatless man in a pink shirt who entered, carrying in his hands an automatic door-closing apparatus. "Where does this go?" inquired the man. Dyke sat down for a moment on a seat that had been removed from a worn-out railway car to do duty in Ruggles' office. On the back of a yellow envelope he made some vague figures with a stump of blue pencil, multiplying, subtracting, perplexing himself with many errors. S. Behrman, the clerk, and the man with the door-closing apparatus involved themselves in a long argument, gazing intently at the top panel of the door. The man who had come to fix the apparatus was unwilling to guarantee it unless a sign was put on the outside of the door warning incomers that the door was self-closing. The sign would cost 15 cents extra. "But you didn't say anything about this when the thing was ordered," declared S. Behrman. "No, I won't pay it, my friend. It's an overcharge." "You needn't think," observed the clerk, "that just because you are dealing with the railroad you are going to work us." Genslinger came in, accompanied by Delaney. S. Behrman and the clerk, abruptly dismissing the man with the door-closing machine, put themselves behind the counter and engaged in conversation with these two. Genslinger introduced Delaney. The buster had a string of horses he was shipping southward. No doubt he had come to make arrangements with the railroad in the matter of stock cars. The conference of the four men was amicable in the extreme. Dyke, studying the figures on the back of the envelope, came forward again. Absorbed only in his own distress, he ignored the editor and the cowpuncher. "Say," he hazarded, "how about this? I make out—" "We've told you what our rates are, Mr. Dyke," exclaimed the clerk angrily. "That's all the arrangement we will make. Take it or leave it." He turned again to Genslinger, giving the ex-engineer his back. Dyke moved away and stood for a moment in the center of the room, staring at the figures on the envelope. "I don't see," he muttered, "just what I'm going to do. No, I don't see what I'm going to do at all." Ruggles came in, bringing with him two other men in whom Dyke recognized dummy buyers of the Los Muertos and Osterman ranchos. They brushed by him, jostling his elbow, and as he went out of the door he heard them exchange jovial greetings with Delaney, Genslinger, and S. Behrman. Dyke went down the stairs to the street and proceeded onward aimlessly in the direction of the Yosemite House, fingering the yellow envelope and looking vacantly at the sidewalk. There was a stoop to his massive shoulders. His great arms dangled loosely at his sides, the palms of his hands open. As he went along, a certain feeling of shame touched him. Surely his predicament must be apparent to every passer-by. No doubt everyone recognized the unsuccessful man in the very way he slouched along. The young girls in lawns, muslins, and garden hats, returning from the post office, their hands full of letters, must surely see in him the type of the failure, the bankrupt. Then brusquely his tardy rage flamed up. By God, no, it was not his fault. He had made no mistake. His energy, industry, and foresight had been sound. He had been merely the object of a colossal trick, a sordid injustice, a victim of the insatiate greed of the monster, caught and choked by one of those millions of tentacles suddenly reaching up from below, from out the dark beneath his feet, coiling around his throat, throttling him, strangling him, sucking his blood. For a moment he thought of the courts, but instantly laughed at the idea. What court was immune from the power of the monster? Ah, the rage of helplessness, the fury of impotence. No help, no hope, ruined in a brief instant. He, a veritable giant, built of great sinews, powerful, in the full tide of his manhood, having all his health, all his wits. How could he now face his home? How could he tell his mother of this catastrophe? And Sidney, the little tad, how could he explain to her this wretchedness? How soften her disappointment? How keep the tears from out her eyes? How keep alive her confidence in him, her faith in his resources? Bitter, fierce, ominous, his wrath loomed up in his heart. His fists gripped tight together, his teeth clenched. Oh, for a moment to have his hand upon the throat of S. Behrman, wringing the breath from him, wrenching out the red life of him, staining the street with the blood sucked from the veins of the people. To the first friend that he met, Dyke told the tale of the tragedy, and to the next, and to the next. The affair went from mouth to mouth, spreading with electrical swiftness, overpassing and running ahead of Dyke himself, so that by the time he reached the lobby of the Yosemite House, he found his story awaiting him. A group formed about him. In his immediate vicinity, business for the instant was suspended. The group swelled. One after another of his friends added themselves to it. Magnus Derrick joined it, and Annixter. Again and again Dyke recounted the matter, beginning with the time when he was discharged from the same corporation service for refusing to accept an unfair wage. His voice quivered with exasperation. His heavy frame shook with rage. His eyes were injected, bloodshot. His face flamed vermilion, while his deep bass rumbled throughout the running comments of his auditors like the thunderous reverberation of diapason. From all points of view, the story was discussed by those who listened to him, now in the heat of excitement, now calmly, judicially. One verdict, however, prevailed. It was voiced by Annixter. "You're stuck. You can roar till you're black in the face, but you can't buck against the railroad. There's nothing to be done." "You can shoot the ruffian. You can shoot S. Behrman," clamored one of the group. "Yes, sir, by the Lord, you can shoot him." "Poor fool," commented Annixter, turning away. Nothing to be done. No, there was nothing to be done, not one thing. Dyke, at last alone, and driving his team out of the town, turned the business confusedly over in his mind, from end to end. Advice, suggestion, even offers of financial aid had been showered upon him from all directions. Friends were not wanting who heatedly presented to his consideration all manner of ingenious plans, wonderful devices. They were worthless. The tentacle held fast. He was stuck. By degrees, as his wagon carried him farther out into the country and open empty fields, his anger lapsed, and the numbness of bewilderment returned. He could not look 1 hour ahead into the future, could formulate no plans even for the next day. He did not know what to do. He was stuck. With the limpness and inertia of a sack of sand, the reins slipping loosely in his dangling fingers, his eyes fixed, staring between the horses' heads, he allowed himself to be carried aimlessly along. He resigned himself. What did he care? What was the use of going on? He was stuck. The team he was driving had once belonged to the Los Muertos stables, and unguided as the horses were, they took the county road toward Derrick's ranch house. Dyke, all abroad, was unaware of the fact till, drawn by the smell of water, the horses halted by the trough in front of Caraher's saloon. The ex-engineer dismounted, looking about him, realizing where he was. So much the worse. It did not matter. Now that he had come so far, it was as short to go home by this route as to return on his tracks. Slowly he unchecked the horses and stood at their heads, watching them drink. "I don't see," he muttered, "just what I am going to do." Caraher appeared at the door of his place, his red face, red beard, and flaming cravat standing sharply out from the shadow of the doorway. He called a welcome to Dyke. "Hello, Captain." Dyke looked up, nodding his head listlessly. "Hello, Caraher," he answered. "Well," continued the saloon-keeper, coming forward a step, "what's the news in town?" Dyke told him. Caraher's red face suddenly took on a darker color. The red glint in his eyes shot from under his eyebrows. Furious, he vented a rolling explosion of oaths. "And now it's your turn," he vociferated. "They ain't after only the big wheat growers, the rich men. By God, they'll even pick the poor man's pocket. Oh, they'll get their bellies full some day. It can't last forever." They'll wake up the wrong kind of man some morning, the man that's got guts in him, that will hit back when he's kicked, and that will talk to him with a torch in one hand and a stick of dynamite in the other." He raised his clenched fists in the air. "So help me God," he cried, "when I think it all over, I go crazy. I see red. Oh, if the people only knew their strength. Oh, if I could wake 'em up. There's not only Shelgrim, but there's others. All the magnates, all the butchers, all the bloodsuckers by the thousands. Their day will come, by God, it will." By now the ex-engineer and the barkeeper had retired to the saloon back of the grocery to talk over the details of this new outrage. Dyke, still a little dazed, sat down by one of the tables, preoccupied, saying but little, and Caraher, as a matter of course, set the whiskey bottle at his elbow. It happened that at this same moment Presley, returning to Los Muertos from Bonneville, his pockets full of mail, stopped in at the grocery to buy some black lead for his bicycle. In the saloon, on the other side of the narrow partition, he overheard the conversation between Dyke and Caraher. The door was open. He caught every word distinctly. "Tell us all about it, Dyke," urged Caraher. For the 50th time Dyke told the story. Already it had crystallized into a certain form. He used the same phrases with each repetition, the same sentences, the same words. In his mind it became set. Thus he would tell it to anyone who would listen from now on, week after week, year after year, all the rest of his life. And I based my calculations on a 2-cent rate. So soon as they saw I was to make money, they doubled the tariff. All the traffic would bear. And I, mortgaged to S. Behrman, ruined me with a turn of the hand, stuck, cinched, and not one thing to be done. As he talked, he drank glass after glass of whiskey, and the honest rage, the open, above-board fury of his mind coagulated, thickened, and sunk to a dull, evil hatred, a wicked, oblique malevolence. Caraher, sure now of winning a disciple, replenished his glass. "Do you blame us now?" he cried. "Us others, the Reds." "Ah, yes, it's all very well for your middle class to preach moderation. I could do it, too. You could do it, too, if your belly was fed, if your property was safe, if your wife had not been murdered, if your children were not starving. Easy enough then to preach law-abiding methods, legal redress, and all such rot. But how about us?" he vociferated. "Ah, yes, I'm a loud-mouthed rum-seller, ain't I? I'm a wild-eyed striker, ain't I? I'm a bloodthirsty anarchist, ain't I? Wait till you've seen your wife brought home to you with the face you used to kiss smashed in by a horse's hoof, killed by the trust, as it happened to me. Then talk about moderation. And you, Dyke, blacklisted engineer, discharged employee, ruined agriculturalist, wait till you see your little tad and your mother turned out of doors when S. Behrman forecloses. Wait till you see 'em getting thin and white, and till you hear your little girl ask you why you didn't eat a little more, and that she wants her dinner and you can't give it to her. Wait till you see, at the same time that your family is dying for lack of bread, 100,000 acres of wheat, millions of bushels of food, grabbed and gobbled by the railroad trust, and then talk of moderation. That talk is just what the trust wants to hear. It ain't frightened of that. There's one thing only it does listen to, one thing it is frightened of, the people with dynamite in their hands, 6 inches of plugged gas pipe. That talks." Dyke did not reply. He filled another pony of whiskey and drank it in 2 gulps. His frown had deepened to a scowl. His face was a dark red. His head had sunk, bull-like, between his massive shoulders. Without winking, he gazed long and with troubled eyes at his knotted, muscular hands, lying open on the table before him, idle, their occupation gone. Presley forgot his black lead. He listened to Caraher. Through the open door he caught a glimpse of Dyke's back, broad, muscled, bowed down, the great shoulders stooping. The whole drama of the doubled freight rate leaped salient and distinct in the eye of his mind. And this was but one instance, an isolated case. Because he was near at hand, he happened to see it. How many others were there, the length and breadth of the state? Constantly this sort of thing must occur. Little industries choked out in their very beginnings, the air full of the death rattles of little enterprises, expiring unobserved in far-off counties, up in canyons and arroyos of the foothills, forgotten by everyone but the monster who was daunted by the magnitude of no business, however great, who overlooked no opportunity of plunder, however petty, who with one tentacle grabbed 100,000 acres of wheat, and with another pilfered a pocketful of growing hops. He went away without a word, his head bent, his hands clutched tightly on the cork grips of the handlebars of his bicycle. His lips were white. In his heart a blind demon of revolt raged tumultuous, shrieking blasphemies. At Los Muertos, Presley overtook Annixter. As he guided his wheel up the driveway to Derrick's ranch house, he saw the master of Quien-Sabe and Heron in conversation on the steps of the porch. Magnus stood in the doorway, talking to his wife. Occupied with the press of business and involved in the final conference with the League's lawyers on the eve of the latter's departure for Washington, Annixter had missed the train that was to take him back to Guadalajara and Quien-Sabe. Accordingly, he had accepted the governor's invitation to return with him on his buckboard to Los Muertos, and before leaving Bonneville had telephoned to his ranch to have young Vaca bring the buckskin by way of the lower road to meet him at Los Muertos. He found her waiting there for him, but before going on delayed a few seconds to tell Heron of Dyke's affair. "I wonder what he will do now," observed Heron, when his first outburst of indignation had subsided. "Nothing," declared Annixter. "He's stuck." "That eats up every cent of Dyke's earnings," Heron went on. "He has been 10 years saving them. Oh, I told him to make sure of the railroad when he first spoke to me about growing hops." "I've just seen him," said Presley, as he joined the others. "He was at Caraher's. I only saw his back. He was drinking at a table, and his back was toward me. But the man looked broken, absolutely crushed. It is terrible, terrible." "He was at Caraher's, was he?" demanded Annixter. "Yes." "Drinking, hey?" "I think so. I saw a bottle." "Drinking at Caraher's," exclaimed Annixter rancorously. "I can see his finish." There was a silence. It seemed as if nothing more was to be said. They paused, looking thoughtfully on the ground. In silence, grim, bitter, infinitely sad, the three men, as if at that moment actually standing in the bar-room of Caraher's roadside saloon, contemplated the slow sinking, the inevitable collapse and submerging of one of their companions, the wreck of a career, the ruin of an individual. An honest man, strong, fearless, upright, struck down by a colossal power, perverted by an evil influence, go reeling to his ruin. "I see his finish," repeated Annixter. "Exit Dyke and score another tally for S. Behrman, Shelgrim and Company." He moved away impatiently, loosening the tie rope with which the buckskin was fastened. He swung himself up. "God for us all," he declared, as he rode away, "and the devil take the hindmost. Good-bye. I'm going home. I still have one a little longer." He galloped away along the lower road in the direction of Quien-Sabe, emerging from the grove of cypress and eucalyptus about the ranch house, and coming out upon the bare brown plain of the wheat land, stretching away from him in apparent barrenness on either hand. It was late in the day. Already his shadow was long upon the padded dust of the road in front of him. On ahead, a long way off and a little to the north, the venerable campanile of the Mission San Juan was glinting radiant in the last rays of the sun, while behind him, toward the north and west, the gilded dome of the courthouse at Bonneville stood silhouetted in purplish black against the flaming west. Annixter spurred the buckskin forward. He feared he might be late to his supper. He wondered if it would be brought to him by Hilma. Hilma. The name struck across in his brain with a pleasant, glowing tremor. All through that day of activity, of strenuous business, the minute and cautious planning of the final campaign in the great war of the League and the Trust, the idea of her and the recollection of her had been the undercurrent of his thoughts. At last he was alone. He could put all other things behind him and occupy himself solely with her. In that glory of the day's end, in that chaos of sunshine, he saw her again. Unimaginative, crude, direct, his fancy nevertheless placed her before him, steeped in sunshine, saturated with glorious light, brilliant, radiant, alluring. He saw the sweet simplicity of her carriage, the statuesque evenness of the contours of her figure, the single deep swell of her bosom, the solid masses of her hair. He remembered the small contradictory suggestions of feminine daintiness he had so often remarked about her. Her slim, narrow feet, the little steel buckles of her low shoes, the knot of black ribbon she had begun to wear of late on the back of her head, and he heard her voice, low-pitched, velvety, a sweet, murmuring huskiness that seemed to come more from her chest than from her throat. The buckskin's hoofs clattered upon the gravelly flats of Broderson's Creek underneath the long trestle. Annixter's mind went back to the scene of the previous evening when he had come upon her at this place. He set his teeth with anger and disappointment. Why had she not been able to understand? What was the matter with these women, always set upon this marrying notion? Was it not enough that he wanted her more than any other girl he knew, and that she wanted him? She had said as much. Did she think she was going to be mistress of Quien-Sabe? Ah, that was it. She was after his property, was for marrying him because of his money. His unconquerable suspicion of the woman, his innate distrust of the feminine element, would not be done away with. What fathomless duplicity was hers, that she could appear to be so innocent. It was almost unbelievable. In fact, was it believable? For the first time doubt assailed him. Suppose Hilma was indeed all that she appeared to be. Suppose it was not with her a question of his property after all. It was a poor time to think of marrying him for his property when all Quien-Sabe hung in the issue of the next few months. Suppose she had been sincere. But he caught himself up. Was he to be fooled by a female girl at this late date? He, Buck Annixter, crafty, hard-headed, a man of affairs? Not much. Whatever transpired, he would remain the master. He reached Quien-Sabe in this frame of mind. But at this hour, Annixter, for all his resolutions, could no longer control his thoughts. As he stripped the saddle from the buckskin and led her to the watering trough by the stable corral, his heart was beating thick at the very notion of being near Hilma again. It was growing dark, but covertly he glanced here and there out of the corners of his eyes to see if she was anywhere about. Annixter, how, he could not tell, had become possessed of the idea that Hilma would not inform her parents of what had passed between them the previous evening under the long trestle. He had no idea that matters were at an end between himself and the young woman. He must apologize. He saw that clearly enough. Must eat crow, as he told himself. Well, he would eat crow. He was not afraid of her any longer, now that she had made her confession to him. He would see her as soon as possible and get this business straightened out and begin again from a new starting point. What he wanted with Hilma, Annixter did not define clearly in his mind. At one time he had known perfectly well what he wanted. Now the goal of his desires had become vague. He could not say exactly what it was. He preferred that things should go forward without much idea of consequences. If consequences came, they would do so naturally enough and of themselves. All that he positively knew was that Hilma occupied his thoughts morning, noon, and night, that he was happy when he was with her and miserable when away from her. The Chinese cook served his supper in silence. Annixter ate and drank and lighted a cigar, and after his meal sat on the porch of his house, smoking and enjoying the twilight. The evening was beautiful, warm, the sky one powder of stars. From the direction of the stables he heard one of the Portuguese hands picking a guitar. But he wanted to see Hilma. The idea of going to bed without at least a glimpse of her became distasteful to him. Annixter got up, and descending from the porch began to walk aimlessly about between the ranch buildings, with eye and ear alert. Possibly he might meet her somewhere. The Trees' little house, toward which inevitably Annixter directed his steps, was dark. Had they all gone to bed so soon? He made a wide circuit about it, listening, but heard no sound. The door of the dairy house stood ajar. He pushed it open and stepped into the odorous darkness of its interior. The pans and deep cans of polished metal glowed faintly from the corners and from the walls. The smell of new cheese was pungent in his nostrils. Everything was quiet. There was nobody there. The pans and deep cans of polished metal glowed faintly from the corners and from the walls. The smell of new cheese was pungent in his nostrils. Everything was quiet. There was nobody there. He went out again, closing the door, and stood for a moment in the space between the dairy house and the new barn, uncertain as to what he should do next. As he waited there, his foreman came out of the men's bunkhouse on the other side of the kitchens and crossed over toward the barn. "Hello, Billy," muttered Annixter as he passed. "Oh, good evening, Mr. Annixter," said the other, pausing in front of him. "I didn't know you were back. By the way," he added, speaking as though the matter was already known to Annixter, "I see Old Man Tree and his family have left us. Are they going to be gone long? Have they left for good?" "What's that?" Annixter exclaimed. "Where did they go? Did all of them go, all three?" "Why, I thought you knew. Sure, they all left on the afternoon train for San Francisco. Cleared out in a hurry, took all their trunks. Yes, all three went, the young lady too. They gave me notice early this morning. They ain't ought to have done that. I don't know who I'm going to get to run the dairy on such short notice." "Do you know anyone, Mr. Annixter?" "Well, why in hell did you let them go?" vociferated Annixter. "Why didn't you keep them here till I got back? Why didn't you find out if they were going for good? I can't be everywhere. What do I feed you for if it ain't to look after things I can't attend to?" He turned on his heel and strode away straight before him, not caring where he was going. He tramped out from the group of ranch buildings, holding on over the open reach of his ranch, his teeth set, his heels digging furiously into the ground. The minutes passed. He walked on swiftly, muttering to himself from time to time. "Gone, by the Lord! Gone, by the Lord! By the Lord Harry, she's cleared out!" As yet his head was empty of all thought. He could not steady his wits to consider this new turn of affairs. He did not even try. "Gone, by the Lord!" he exclaimed. "By the Lord, she's cleared out!" He found the irrigating ditch and the beaten path made by the ditch tenders that bordered it, and followed it some 5 minutes, then struck off at right angles over the rugged surface of the ranch land to where a great white stone jutted from the ground. There he sat down, and leaning forward, rested his elbows on his knees, and looked out vaguely into the night, his thoughts swiftly readjusting themselves. He was alone. The silence of the night, the infinite repose of the flat, bare earth, two immensities, widened around and above him like illimitable seas. A gray half-light, mysterious, grave, flooded downward from the stars. Annixter was in torment. Now there could be no longer any doubt. Now it was Hilma or nothing. Once out of his reach, once lost to him, and the recollection of her assailed him with unconquerable vehemence. Much as she had occupied his mind, he had never realized till now how vast had been the place she had filled in his life. He had told her as much, but even then he did not believe it. Suddenly a bitter rage against himself overwhelmed him as he thought of the hurt he had given her the previous evening. He should have managed differently. How, he did not know, but the sense of the outrage he had put upon her abruptly recoiled against him with cruel force. Now he was sorry for it, infinitely sorry, passionately sorry. He had hurt her. He had brought the tears to her eyes. He had so flagrantly insulted her that she could no longer bear to breathe the same air with him. She had told her parents all. She had left Kiansabi, had left him for good, at the very moment when he believed he had won her. Brute, beast that he was, he had driven her away. An hour went by, then 2, then 4, then 6. Annixter still sat in his place, groping and battling in a confusion of spirit, the like of which he had never felt before. He did not know what was the matter with him. He could not find his way out of the dark and out of the turmoil that wheeled around him. He had had no experience with women. There was no precedent to guide him. How was he to get out of this? What was the clue that would set everything straight again? That he would give Hilma up never once entered his mind. Have her he would. She had given herself to him. Everything should have been easy after that. And instead, here he was alone in the night, wrestling with himself, in deeper trouble than ever, and Hilma farther than ever away from him. It was true, he might have Hilma even now if he was willing to marry her. But marriage, to his mind, had been always a vague, most remote possibility, almost as vague and as remote as his death, a thing that happened to some men, but that would surely never occur to him, or if it did, it would be long after years had passed, when he was older, more settled, more mature, and events that belonged to the period of his middle life, distant as yet. He had never faced the question of his marriage. He had kept it at an immense distance from him. It had never been a part of his order of things. He was not a marrying man. But Hilma was an ever-present reality, as near to him as his right hand. Marriage was a formless, far distant abstraction. Hilma a tangible, imminent fact. Before he could think of the two as one, before he could consider the idea of marriage side by side with the idea of Hilma, measureless distances had to be traversed. Things as disassociated in his mind as fire and water had to be fused together. And between the two he was torn, as if upon a rack. Slowly, by imperceptible degrees, the imagination, unused, unwilling machine, began to work. The brain's activity lapsed proportionately. He began to think less and feel more. In that rugged composition, confused, dark, harsh, a furrow had been driven deep, a little seed planted, a little seed at first weak, forgotten, lost in the lower dark places of his character. But as the intellect moved slower, its functions growing numb, the idea of self dwindled. Annixter no longer considered himself, no longer considered the notion of marriage from the point of view of his own comfort, his own wishes, his own advantage. He realized that in his new-found desire to make her happy he was sincere. There was something in that idea, after all, to make someone happy. How about that now? It was worth thinking of. Far away, low down in the east, a dim belt, a gray light began to whiten over the horizon. The tower of the mission stood black against it. The dawn was coming. The baffling obscurity of the night was passing. Hidden things were coming into view. Annixter, his eyes half closed, his chin upon his fist, allowed his imagination full play. How would it be if he should take Hilma into his life, this beautiful young girl, pure as he now knew her to be, innocent, noble with the inborn nobility of dawning womanhood? An overwhelming sense of his own unworthiness suddenly bore down upon him with crushing force as he thought of this. He had gone about the whole affair wrongly. He had been mistaken from the very first. She was infinitely above him. He did not want, he should not desire to be the master. It was she, his servant, poor, simple, lowly even, who should condescend to him. Abruptly there was presented to his mind's eye a picture of the years to come, if he now should follow his best, his highest, his most unselfish impulse. He saw Hilma, his own, for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer, all barriers down between them, he giving himself to her as freely, as nobly, as she had given herself to him. By a supreme effort, not of the will, but of the emotion, he fought his way across that vast gulf that for a time had gaped between Hilma and the idea of his marriage. Instantly, like the swift blending of beautiful colors, like the harmony of beautiful chords of music, the two ideas melted into one, and in that moment, into his harsh, unlovely world, a new idea was born. Annixter stood suddenly upright, a mighty tenderness, a gentleness of spirit, such as he had never conceived of, in his heart strained, swelled, and in a moment seemed to burst. Out of the dark furrows of his soul, up from the deep, rugged recesses of his being, something rose, expanding. He opened his arms wide. An immense happiness overpowered him. Actual tears came to his eyes. Without knowing why, he was not ashamed of it. This poor, crude fellow, harsh, hard, narrow, with his unlovely nature, his fierce truculency, his selfishness, his obstinacy, abruptly knew that all the sweetness of life, all the great vivifying eternal force of humanity, had burst into life within him. The little seed, long since planted, gathering strength, quietly had at last germinated. Then, as the realization of this hardened into certainty, in the growing light of the new day that had just dawned for him, Annixter uttered a cry. Now, at length, he knew the meaning of it all. "Why, I love her," he cried. Never until then had it occurred to him. Never until then, in all his thoughts of Hilma, had that great word passed his lips. It was a Memnonian cry, the greeting of the hard, harsh image of man, rough-hewn, flinty, granitic, uttering a note of joy, acclaiming the new risen sun. By now it was almost day. The east glowed opalescent. All about him Annixter saw the land inundated with light. But there was a change. Overnight something had occurred. In his perturbation the change seemed to him, at first, elusive, almost fanciful, unreal. But now, as the light spread, he looked again at the gigantic scroll of ranch lands unrolled before him from edge to edge of the horizon. The change was not fanciful. The change was real. The earth was no longer bare. The land was no longer barren, no longer empty, no longer dull brown. All at once Annixter shouted aloud. There it was, the wheat, the wheat! The little seed, long planted, germinating in the deep, dark furrows of the soil, straining, swelling, suddenly in one night had burst upward to the light. The wheat had come up. It was there before him, around him, everywhere, illimitable, immeasurable. The winter brownness of the ground was overlaid with a little shimmer of green. The promise of the sowing was being fulfilled. The earth, the loyal mother who never failed, who never disappointed, was keeping her faith again. Once more the strength of nations was renewed. Once more the force of the world was revivified. Once more the Titan, benignant, calm, stirred and woke, and the morning abruptly blazed into glory upon the spectacle of a man whose heart leaped exuberant with the love of a woman, and an exulting earth gleaming transcendent with the radiant magnificence of an inviolable pledge. Chapter 3. Presley's room in the ranch house of Los Muertos was in the second story of the building. It was a corner room, one of its windows facing the south, the other the east. Its appointments were of the simplest. In one angle was the small white-painted iron bed, covered with a white counterpane. The walls were hung with a white paper figured with knots of pale green leaves, very gay and bright. There was a straw matting on the floor. White muslin half-curtains hung in the windows, upon the sills of which certain plants bearing pink waxen flowers, of which Presley did not know the name, grew in oblong green boxes. The walls were unadorned, save by two pictures, one a reproduction of the reading from Homer, the other a charcoal drawing of the mission of San Juan de Guadalajara, which Presley had made himself. By the east window stood the plainest of deal tables, innocent of any cloth or covering, such as might have been used in a kitchen. It was Presley's work table, and was invariably littered with papers, half-finished manuscripts, drafts of poems, notebooks, pens, half-smoked cigarettes, and the like. Near at hand, upon a shelf, were his books. There were but two chairs in the room, the straight-backed wooden chair that stood in front of the table, angular, upright, and in which it was impossible to take one's ease, and the long, comfortable wicker steamer chair, stretching its length in front of the south window. Presley was immensely fond of this room. It amused and interested him to maintain its air of rigorous simplicity and freshness. He abhorred cluttered bric-a-brac and meaningless objets d'art. Once in so often he submitted his room to a vigorous inspection, setting it to rights, removing everything but the essentials, the few ornaments which, in a way, were part of his life. His writing had by this time undergone a complete change. The notes for his great Song of the West, the epic poem he once had hoped to write, he had flung aside, together with all the abortive attempts at its beginning. Also, he had torn up a great quantity of fugitive verses, preserving only a certain half-finished poem that he called The Toilers. This poem was a comment upon the social fabric, and had been inspired by the sight of a painting he had seen in Cedarquist's art gallery. He had written all but the last verse. On the day that he had overheard the conversation between Dyke and Caraher in the latter's saloon, which had acquainted him with the monstrous injustice of the increased tariff, Presley had returned to Los Muertos, white and trembling, roused to a pitch of exultation the like of which he had never known in all his life. His wrath was little short of even Caraher's. He, too, saw red. A mighty spirit of revolt heaved tumultuous within him. It did not seem possible that this outrage could go on much longer. The oppression was incredible. The plain story of it, set down in truthful statement of fact, would not be believed by the outside world. He went up to his little room and paced the floor with clenched fists and burning face, till at last the repression of his contending thoughts all but suffocated him, and he flung himself before his table and began to write. For a time his pen seemed to travel of itself. Words came to him without searching, shaping themselves into phrases, the phrases building themselves up into great forcible sentences, full of eloquence, of fire, of passion. As his prose grew more exalted, it passed easily into the domain of poetry. Soon the cadence of his paragraphs settled to an ordered beat and rhythm, and in the end Presley had thrust aside his journal and was once more writing verse. He picked up his incomplete poem of The Toilers, read it hastily a couple of times to catch its swing, then the idea of the last verse, the idea for which he so long had sought in vain, abruptly springing to his brain, wrote it off without so much as replenishing his pen with ink. He added still another verse, bringing the poem to a definite close, resuming its entire conception, and ending with a single majestic thought, simple, noble, dignified, absolutely convincing. Presley laid down his pen and leaned back in his chair, with the certainty that for one moment he had touched untrod heights. His hands were cold, his head on fire, his heart leaping tumultuous in his breast. Now, at last, he had achieved. He saw why he had never grasped the inspiration for his vast, vague, impersonal Song of the West. At the time when he sought for it, his convictions had not been aroused. He had not then cared for the people. His sympathies had not been touched. Small wonder that he had missed it. Now he was of the people. He had been stirred to his lowest depths. His earnestness was almost a frenzy. He believed, and so to him all things were possible at once. Then the artist in him reasserted itself. He became more interested in his poem as such than in the cause that had inspired it. He went over it again, retouching it carefully, changing a word here and there, and improving its rhythm. For the moment he forgot the people, forgot his rage, his agitation of the previous hour. He remembered only that he had written a great poem. Then doubt intruded. After all, was it so great? Did not its sublimity overpass a little the bounds of the ridiculous? Had he seen true? Had he failed again? He reread the poem carefully, and it seemed all at once to lose force. By now, Presley could not tell whether what he had written was true poetry or doggerel. He distrusted profoundly his own judgment. He must have the opinion of someone else, someone competent to judge. He could not wait. Tomorrow would not do. He must know to a certainty before he could rest that night. He made a careful copy of what he had written, and putting on his hat and laced boots, went downstairs and out upon the lawn, crossing over the stables. He found Phelps there, washing down the buckboard. "Do you know where Vanamee is today?" he asked the latter. Phelps put his chin in the air. "Ask me something easy," he responded. "He might be at Guadalajara, or he might be up at Osterman's, or he might be 100 miles away from either place. I know where he ought to be, Mr. Presley, but that ain't saying where the crazy Gosabe is. He ought to be range riding over east of 4, at the headwaters of Mission Creek." "I'll try for him there at all events," answered Presley. "If you see Heron when he comes in, tell him I may not be back in time for supper." Presley found the pony in the corral, cinched the saddle upon him, and went off over the lower road, going eastward at a brisk canter. At Hooven's he called a "How do you do" to Minna, whom he saw lying in a slat hammock under the mammoth live oak, her foot in bandages, and then galloped on over the bridge across the irrigating ditch, wondering vaguely what would become of such a pretty girl as Minna, and if in the end she would marry the Portuguese foreman in charge of the ditching gang. He told himself that he hoped she would, and that speedily. There was no lack of comment as to Minna Hooven about the ranches. Certainly she was a good girl, but she was seen at all hours here and there about Bonneville and Guadalajara, skylarking with the Portuguese farmhands of Quien-Sabe and Los Muertos. She was very pretty. The men made fools of themselves over her. Presley hoped they would not end by making a fool of her. Just beyond the irrigating ditch, Presley left the lower road, and following a trail that branched off southeasterly from this point, held on across the 4th Division of the ranch, keeping the Mission Creek on his left. A few miles farther on, he went through a gate and a barbed wire fence, and at once engaged himself in a system of little arroyos and low rolling hills that steadily lifted and increased in size as he proceeded. This higher ground was the advance guard of the Sierra foothills, and served as the stock range for Los Muertos. The hills were huge rolling hummocks of bare ground, covered only by wild oats. At long intervals were isolated live oaks. In the canyons and arroyos, the chaparral and manzanita grew in dark olive-green thickets. The ground was honeycombed with gopher holes, and the gophers themselves were everywhere. Occasionally a jackrabbit bounded across the open from one growth of chaparral to another, taking long leaps, his ears erect. High overhead, a hawk or two swung at anchor, and once, with a startling rush of wings, a covey of quail flushed from the brush at the side of the trail. On the hillsides, in thinly scattered groups, were the cattle, grazing deliberately, working slowly towards the water holes for their evening drink, the horses keeping to themselves, the colts nuzzling at their mothers' bellies, whisking their tails, stamping their unshod feet. But once, in a remoter field, solitary, magnificent, enormous, the short hair curling tight upon his forehead, his small red eyes twinkling, his vast neck heavy with muscles, Presley came upon the monarch, the king, the great Durham bull, maintaining his lonely state, unapproachable, austere. Presley found the one-time shepherd by a water-hole in a far distant corner of the range. He had made his simple camp for the night. His blue-gray army blanket lay spread under a live oak, his horse grazed near at hand. He himself sat on his heels before a little fire of dead manzanita roots, cooking his coffee and bacon. Never had Presley conceived so keen an impression of loneliness as his crouching figure presented. The bald, bare landscape widened about him to infinity. Vanamee was a spot in it all, a tiny dot, a single atom of human organization floating endlessly on the ocean of an illimitable nature. The two friends ate together, and Vanamee, having snared a brace of quails, dressed and then roasted them on a sharpened stick. After eating, they drank great, refreshing draughts from the water-hole. Then, at length, Presley having lit his cigarette and Vanamee his pipe, the former said, "Vanamee, I have been writing again." Vanamee turned his lean, ascetic face toward him, his black eyes fixed attentively. "I know," he said, "your journal." "No, this is a poem. You remember I told you about it once. The Toilers, I called it." "Oh, verse. Well, I am glad you have gone back to it. It is your natural vehicle." "You remember the poem?" asked Presley. "It was unfinished." "Yes, I remember it. There was better promise in it than anything you ever wrote. Now I suppose you have finished it." Without reply, Presley brought it from out the breast pocket of his shooting coat. The moment seemed propitious. The stillness of the vast bare hills was profound. The sun was setting in a cloudless brazier of red light. A golden dust pervaded all the landscape. Presley read his poem aloud. When he had finished, his friend looked at him. "What have you been doing lately?" he demanded. Presley, wondering, told him of his various comings and goings. "I don't mean that," returned the other. "Something has happened to you. Something has aroused you. I am right, am I not?" "Yes, I thought so." "In this poem of yours, you have not been trying to make a sounding piece of literature. You wrote it under tremendous stress. Its very imperfections show that. It is better than a mere rhyme. It is an utterance, a message. It is truth. You have come back to the primal heart of things, and you have seen clearly. Yes, it is a great poem." "Thank you," exclaimed Presley fervidly. "I had begun to mistrust myself." "Now," observed Vanamee, "I presume you will rush it into print. To have formulated a great thought, simply to have accomplished, is not enough." "I think I am sincere," objected Presley. "If it is good, it will do good to others. You said yourself it was a message. If it has any value, I do not think it would be right to keep back from even a very small and most indifferent public." "Don't publish it in the magazines, at all events," Vanamee answered. "Your inspiration has come from the people. Then let it go straight to the people, not the literary readers of the monthly periodicals, the rich, who would be only indirectly interested. If you must publish it, let it be in the daily press. Don't interrupt. I know what you will say. It will be that the daily press is common, is vulgar, is undignified. And I tell you that such a poem as this of yours, called as it is The Toilers, must be read by the toilers. It must be common. It must be vulgarized. You must not stand upon your dignity with the people if you are to reach them." "That is true, I suppose," Presley admitted, "but I can't get rid of the idea that it would be throwing my poem away. The great magazine gives me such a background, gives me such weight." "Gives you such weight? Gives you such a background? Is it yourself you think of, you helper of the helpless? Is that your sincerity? You must sink yourself. You must forget yourself and your own desire of fame, of admitted success. It is your poem, your message, that must prevail, not you who wrote it. You preach a doctrine of abnegation, of self-obliteration, and you sign your name to your words as high on the tablets as you can reach, so that all the world may see, not the poem, but the poet. Presley, there are many like you. The social reformer writes a book on the iniquity of the possession of land, and out of the proceeds buys a corner lot. The economist, who laments the hardships of the poor, allows himself to grow rich upon the sale of his book. But Presley would hear no further. "No," he cried, "I know I am sincere, and to prove it to you I will publish my poem, as you say, in the daily press, and I will accept no money for it." They talked on for about an hour, while the evening wore away. Presley very soon noticed that Vanamee was again preoccupied. More than ever, of late, his silence, his brooding, had increased. By and by he rose abruptly, turning his head to the north, in the direction of the mission church of San Juan. "I think," he said to Presley, "that I must be going." "Going? Where to at this time of night?" "Off there." Vanamee made an uncertain gesture toward the north. "Good-bye." And without another word he disappeared in the gray of the twilight. Presley was left alone, wondering. He found his horse, and, tightening the girths, mounted and rode home under the sheen of the stars, thoughtful, his head bowed. Before he went to bed that night, he sent the Toilers to the Sunday editor of a daily newspaper in San Francisco. Upon leaving Presley, Vanamee, his thumbs hooked into his empty cartridge belt, strode swiftly down from the hills of the Los Muertos stock range and on through the silent town of Guadalajara. His lean, swarthy face, with its hollow cheeks, fine, black-pointed beard, and sad eyes, was set to the northward. As was his custom, he was bareheaded, and the rapidity of his stride made a breeze in his long black hair. He knew where he was going. He knew what he must live through that night. Again, the deathless grief that never slept leaped out of the shadows and fastened upon his shoulders. It was scourging him back to that scene of a vanished happiness, a dead romance, a perished idyll, the mission garden in the shade of the venerable pear trees. But besides this, other influences tugged at his heart. There was a mystery in the garden. In that spot the night was not always empty, the darkness not always silent. Something far off stirred and listened to his cry, at times drawing nearer to him. At first this presence had been a matter for terror, but of late, as he felt it gradually drawing nearer, the terror had at long intervals given place to a feeling of an almost ineffable sweetness. But distrusting his own senses, unwilling to submit himself to such torturing, uncertain happiness, averse to the terrible confusion of spirit that followed upon a night spent in the garden, Vanamee had tried to keep away from the place. However, when the sorrow of his life reassailed him, and the thoughts and recollections of Onele brought the ache into his heart and the tears to his eyes, the temptation to return to the garden invariably gripped him close. There were times when he could not resist. Of themselves his footsteps turned in that direction. It was almost as if he himself had been called. Guadalajara was silent, dark. Not even in Solitaires was there a light. The town was asleep. Only the inevitable guitar hummed from an unseen dobie. Vanamee pushed on. The smell of the fields and open country, and a distant scent of flowers that he knew well, came to his nostrils as he emerged from the town by way of the road that led on toward the mission through Quien-Sabe. On either side of him lay the brown earth, silently nurturing the implanted seed. 2 days before it had rained copiously, and the soil, still moist, disengaged a pungent aroma of fecundity. Vanamee, following the road, passed through the collection of buildings of Annixter's home ranch. Everything slept. At intervals, the air motor on the artesian well creaked audibly as it turned in a languid breeze from the northeast. A cat, hunting field mice, crept from the shadow of the gigantic barn and paused uncertainly in the open, the tip of her tail twitching. From within the barn itself came the sound of the friction of a heavy body and a stir of hoofs, as one of the dozing cows lay down with a long breath. Vanamee left the ranch house behind him and proceeded on his way. Beyond him, to the right of the road, he could make out the higher ground in the mission enclosure and the watching tower of the mission itself. The minutes passed. He went steadily forward. Then abruptly he paused, his head in the air, eye and ear alert. To that strange sixth sense of his, responsive as the leaves of the sensitive plant, had suddenly come the impression of a human being near at hand. He had neither seen nor heard, but for all that he stopped an instant in his tracks. Then, the sensation confirmed, went on again with slow steps, advancing warily. At last his swiftly roving eyes lighted upon an object just darker than the gray-brown of the night-ridden land. It was at some distance from the roadside. Vanamee approached it cautiously, leaving the road, treading carefully upon the moist clods of earth underfoot. 20 paces distant he halted. Annixter was there, seated upon a round white rock, his back toward him. He was leaning forward, his elbows on his knees, his chin in his hands. He did not move. Silent, motionless, he gazed out upon the flat, somber land. It was the night wherein the master of Quien-Sabe wrought out his salvation, struggling with self from dusk to dawn. At the moment when Vanamee came upon him, the turmoil within him had only begun. The heart of the man had not yet wakened. The night was young, the dawn far distant, and all around him the fields of upturned clods lay bare and brown, empty of all life, unbroken by a single green shoot. For a moment the life circles of these two men, of so widely differing characters, touched each other, there in the silence of the night under the stars. Then silently Vanamee withdrew, going on his way, wondering at the trouble that, like himself, drove this hard-headed man of affairs, untroubled by dreams, out into the night to brood over an empty land. Then speedily he forgot all else. The material world drew off from him. Reality dwindled to a point and vanished like the vanishing of a star at moonrise. Earthly things dissolved and disappeared as a strange, unnamed essence flowed in upon him. A new atmosphere for him pervaded his surroundings. He entered the world of the vision, of the legend, of the miracle, where all things were possible. He stood at the gate of the mission garden. Above him rose the ancient tower of the mission church. Through the arches at its summit, where swung the Spanish Queen's bells, he saw the slow-burning stars. The silent bats, with flickering wings, threw their dancing shadows on the pallid surface of the venerable facade. Not the faintest chirring of a cricket broke the silence. The bees were asleep. in the grasses, in the trees, deep in the calyx of puncaflower and magnolia bloom, the gnats, the caterpillars, the beetles, all the microscopic, multitudinous life of the daytime, drowsed and dozed. Not even the minute scuffling of a lizard over the warm, worn pavement of the colonnade disturbed the infinite repose, the profound stillness. Only within the garden the intermittent trickling of the fountain made itself heard, flowing steadily, marking off the lapse of seconds, the progress of hours, the cycle of years, the inevitable march of centuries. At one time the doorway before which Vanamee now stood had been hermetically closed, but he himself had long since changed that. He stood before it for a moment, steeping himself in the mystery and romance of the place, then raising the latch, pushed open the gate, entered, and closed it softly behind him. He was in the cloister garden. The stars were out, strewn thick and close in the deep blue of the sky, the Milky Way glowing like a silver veil. Ursa Major wheeled, gigantic in the north. The great nebula in Orion was a whorl of shimmering stardust. Venus flamed a lambent disk of pale saffron, low over the horizon. From edge to edge of the world marched the constellations, like the progress of emperors, and from the innumerable glory of their courses a mysterious sheen of diaphanous light disengaged itself, expanding over all the earth, serene, infinite, majestic. The little garden revealed itself but dimly beneath the brooding light, only half emerging from the shadow. The polished surfaces of the leaves of the pear trees winked faintly back the reflected light as the trees just stirred in the uncertain breeze. A blurred shield of silver marked the ripples of the fountain. Under the flood of dull blue luster, the gravelled walks lay vague amid the grasses, like webs of white satin on the bed of a lake. Against the eastern wall the headstones of the graves, an indistinct procession of gray cowls, ranged themselves. Vanamee crossed the garden, pausing to kiss the turf upon Angele's grave. Then he approached the line of pear trees and laid himself down in their shadow, his chin propped upon his hands, his eyes wandering over the expanse of the little valley that stretched away from the foot of the hill upon which the mission was built. Once again he summoned the vision. Once again he conjured up the illusion. Once again, tortured with doubt, racked with a deathless grief, he craved an answer of the night. Once again, mystic that he was, he sent his mind out from him across the enchanted sea of the supernatural. Hope, of what he did not know, roused up within him. Surely on such a night as this, the hallucination must define itself. Surely the manifestation must be vouchsafed. His eyes closed, his will girding itself to a supreme effort, his senses exalted to a state of pleasing numbness. He called upon Angele to come to him, his voiceless cry penetrating far out into that sea of faint, ephemeral light that floated tideless over the little valley beneath him. Then, motionless, prone upon the ground, he waited. Months had passed since that first night when, at length, an answer had come to Vanamee. At first, startled out of all composure, troubled and stirred to his lowest depths, because of the very thing for which he sought, he resolved never again to put his strange powers to the test. But for all that, he had come a second night to the garden, and a third, and a fourth. At last his visits were habitual. Night after night he was there, surrendering himself to the influences of the place, gradually convinced that something did actually answer when he called. His faith increased as the winter grew into spring. As the spring advanced and the nights became shorter, it crystallized into certainty. Would he have her again, his love, long dead? Would she come to him once more out of the grave, out of the night? He could not tell. He could only hope. All that he knew was that his cry found an answer, that his outstretched hands, groping in the darkness, met the touch of other fingers. Patiently he waited. The nights became warmer as the spring drew on. The stars shone clearer. The nights seemed brighter. For nearly a month after the occasion of his first answer, nothing new occurred. Some nights it failed him entirely. Upon others it was faint, elusive. Then, at last, the most subtle, the barest of perceptible changes began. His groping mind far off there, wandering like a lost bird over the valley, touched upon something again, touched and held it, and this time drew it a single step closer to him. His heart beating, the blood surging in his temples, he watched with the eyes of his imagination this gradual approach. What was coming to him? Who was coming to him? Shrouded in the obscurity of the night, whose was the face now turned toward his? Whose the footsteps that with such infinite slowness drew nearer to where he waited? He did not dare to say. His mind went back many years to that time before the tragedy of Onele's death, before the mystery of the other. He waited then as he waited now. But then he had not waited in vain. Then, as now, he had seemed to feel her approach, seemed to feel her drawing nearer and nearer to their rendezvous. Now what would happen? He did not know. He waited. He waited, hoping all things. He waited, believing all things. He waited, enduring all things. He trusted in the vision. Meanwhile, as spring advanced, the flowers in the seed ranch began to come to life. Over the 500 acres whereon the flowers were planted, the widening growth of vines and bushes spread like the waves of a green sea. Then, timidly, colors of the faintest tints began to appear. Under the moonlight, Vanamee saw them expanding, delicate pink, faint blue, tenderest variations of lavender and yellow, white shimmering with reflections of gold, all subdued and pallid in the moonlight. By degrees the night became impregnated with the perfume of the flowers. Elusive at first, evanescent as filaments of gossamer. Then, as the buds opened, emphasizing itself, breathing deeper, stronger. An exquisite mingling of many odors passed continually over the mission from the garden of the seed ranch, meeting and blending with the aroma of its magnolia buds and ponca blossoms. As the colors of the flowers of the seed ranch deepened, and as their odors penetrated deeper and more distinctly, as the starlight of each succeeding night grew brighter and the air became warmer, the illusion defined itself. By imperceptible degrees, as Vanamee waited under the shadows of the pear trees, the answer grew nearer and nearer. He saw nothing but the distant glimmer of the flowers. He heard nothing but the drip of the fountain. Nothing moved about him but the invisible, slow-passing breaths of perfume. Yet he felt the approach of the vision. It came first to about the middle of the seed ranch itself, some half a mile away, where the violets grew. Shrinking, timid flowers hiding close to the ground. Then it passed forward beyond the violets and drew nearer and stood amid the mignonette, hardier blooms that dared look heavenward from out of the leaves. A few nights later it left the mignonette behind and advanced into the beds of white iris that pushed more boldly forth from the earth, their waxen petals claiming the attention. It advanced then a long step into the proud, challenging beauty of the carnations and roses. And at last, after many nights, Vanamee felt that it paused as if trembling at its hardihood, full in the superb glory of the royal lilies themselves that grew on the extreme border of the seed ranch nearest to him. After this there was a certain long wait. Then, upon a dark midnight, it advanced again. Vanamee could scarcely repress a cry. Now the illusion emerged from the flowers. It stood, not distant, but unseen, almost at the base of the hill upon whose crest he waited, in a depression of the ground where the shadows lay thickest. It was nearly within earshot. The nights passed. The spring grew warmer. In the daytime, intermittent rains freshened all the earth. The flowers of the seed ranch grew rapidly. Bud after bud burst forth, while those already opened expanded to full maturity. The color of the seed ranch deepened. One night, after long hours of waiting, Vanamee felt upon his cheek the touch of a prolonged puff of warm wind, breathing across the little valley from out of the east. It reached the mission garden and stirred the branches of the pear trees. It seemed veritably to be compounded of the very essence of the flowers. Never had the aroma been so sweet, so pervasive. It passed and faded, leaving in its wake an absolute silence. Then, at length, the silence of the night, that silence to which Vanamee had so long appealed, was broken by a tiny sound. Alert, half risen from the ground, he listened. For now, at length, he heard something. The sound repeated itself. It came from near at hand, from the thick shadow at the foot of the hill. What it was he could not tell, but it did not belong to a single one of the infinite similar noises of the place with which he was so familiar. It was neither the rustle of a leaf, the snap of a parted twig, the drone of an insect, nor the dropping of a magnolia blossom. It was a vibration merely, faint, elusive, impossible of definition, a minute notch in the fine, keen edge of stillness. Again the nights passed. The summer stars became brighter. The warmth increased. The flowers of the seed ranch grew still more.